Hi all, just wanted to make a video on HMOs. So HMO properties are houses of multiple occupancy. If you're into the property world to any extent, you probably have heard a lot about these kinds of properties from YouTube. They're basically more lucrative than standard buy-to-let properties because you can rent the property out room by room. So for example, one 3-bed house could rent out for about £1,000 to a single family, whereas if you rent it room by room, they may go for £500 per room, making the total rent £1,500. In Coventry, the rules for HMO were such that it becomes an HMO if there's 3 or more unrelated people with 2 or more surnames. Prior to 2020, I was able to rent out properties to students who were unrelated. I had 3 or 4-bed properties and they were being rented to students room by room, and it was not deemed an HMO at the time. But I think the council started to clamp down because many residents preferred there not to be so many student properties in the city. They're starting to dominate many areas, so this was clamped down upon by the council and many of the properties had to go to Article 4. The university subsequently built their own accommodation and took much of the HMO market in Coventry. There is still a substantial HMO market in Coventry, but it's not like it used to be. This has also happened in many other cities. So again, the advantages of HMO are that they can offer higher rental yields. There are fewer void periods. In a 4-bed HMO, for example, if one person moves out, it's not the end of the world because the other 3 rooms are carrying the rent and a 4th person is likely to move back in. Another issue with them is that they require a lot of compliance. So in 2020, when Coventry became Article 4, I had properties that had to become HMO if I wanted to continue renting them out to unrelated people. This became a bit of a nightmare because the council required us to send in contractors during COVID, which was quite odd. So I had to send in electricians and other contractors to assess the suitability of my properties for HMO purposes. The electricians had to wire smoke alarms to the mains, for example. Contractors had to change the doors such that the doors, when opened and then released, had to shut by themselves completely. If this did not happen, then the properties weren't not compliant. For larger structural changes, you potentially needed planning permission to convert them to HMO. So a lot of costs went into changing properties and making sure they were compliant. So with quite a few of my properties, either 1 or 2 of the bedrooms were not large enough to convert to HMO. That means if I had converted them to HMO, then 1 or 2 of the rooms would have been usable, but then the other 2 would not have been rentable. This made the whole endeavour sort of unviable. I did have an interesting and rather annoying case with another property. It was a 4-bedroom property. It was 3 stories. The living room was exposed to the staircase, so when you came into the property, you'd walk into the living room, and then from the living room you could get straight up to the stairs. So in the event of a fire, if there was a fire in the living room, then the tenants upstairs would not be able to escape the property because the only way out was through the living room. The tenants on the first floor were potentially able to jump out of the window, but as it was a 3-story property, the tenant on the top floor would not have been able to escape. So either this tenant needed his own fire escape stairs, which I would have had to build, or the other option was to build a stud wall in the living room. So this would separate the staircase from the living room and make a separate corridor to the staircase. So if there was a fire in the living room, then tenants would still be able to potentially evacuate the property due to the construction of this stud wall, which created a little corridor. These were 2 potential routes I could have taken with this property, but then I was warned by someone else that in a few years the council may then decide to impose new dimension restrictions on the living rooms. So potentially the living rooms would become too small, and then we would have had to extend the living room into the garden, which would have been a costly exercise in a few years. This was not definitely going to happen, but it's the kind of thing that could happen when dealing with HMOs. The other issue I had at the time was the agency who was managing the property. They took it on as an HMO, or they were at least prepared to, but during this process it became apparent that they did not know how to manage HMOs. For example, when one tenant moves in and there have already been 2 or 3 other tenants in the property for a while, then how a bill split, minor issues like that. The new tenant would not have been liable for bills before they moved in. There are agencies that specialise in this, but the agency that was managing this property were not able to do this and seemed to be making up things as they went along. The council then came to check the property and assess it, and it turned out I needed an alarm test at least once a month, and the agency were then going to charge me more for this. It was obviously something that they had not factored in at the start and did not fully know how to deal with. So these added complications for me at the time made HMOs quite unviable. By the time I had got to this stage, I'd already spent hundreds in changing the property to an HMO. This was pretty much mandatory at the time because I had tenants who were unrelated in the property, and Article 4 was brought in at this time, and it was during COVID, so it was not the best time, to say the very least. There are many people that do go down the HMO route. Some people really specialise in it. They've had mentorships, and if done properly and professionally, and you've sourced the area and the property properly, and it gets well managed, then of course it's a viable option. It's just not a viable option for me because I had properties that were previously just BTL. They were quite large. They did have 3 or 4 separate rooms, but I did not set out to do HMOs from the very start, which means when regulations changed, I was in a bit of trouble because I could not adapt as effectively. So for me, in the end, it wasn't worthwhile to convert my properties to HMO. I then just changed them all back to single let and rented them out to families. But I was also discovering at this time there are many advantages just to rent properties out to families. You don't need to furnish them, you don't even need to put up curtains in many cases because families live there for a long time. They want all their own furniture and decorations. Families often settle with children start going to the local schools, and so you have long-term tenants with no voids. The HMO model is entirely viable if done, sourced and managed correctly, because it's more of a fussy setup. I do know a rather large property investor. He doesn't touch HMOs himself. He just cannot be bothered with the hassle, and he's done extremely well just from single lets. Planning, licensing and fire assessments are all necessary in HMOs. These have to be factored in. There are ongoing inspections and certifications. These you cannot get away from. There are very minor to very major requirements required in HMOs, and the potential for constantly changing rules. Council standards, as mentioned, are probably unpredictable. In a few years they may change their mind and add new regulations. This further complicates matters, but for people who have properly done HMOs from the start, they could have made large cash flows by the time these regulations change, and they would have enough money to adapt to the changes. So HMOs can be worth it, but not always, especially if councils are strict. What happened in Coventry was that there was a huge boom in the student population. Many local residents got annoyed by this because there were so many student rental properties, and as landlords, including myself, were benefiting from this change in regulation caused us to lose our market. But every city is different. Article 4 has been brought into many other cities, but if you factor this in as mentioned, then HMOs are still potentially viable. My advice would be to understand your council's rules, go into depth on these, meet people from the council, make inquiries, phone calls, speak to property investors in your area. As long as you understand the council and how they operate, this can really help in your HMO endeavours. I'm a property investor with about 25 years of landlord experience. Thanks for watching the video. Please get in touch if you need any help or advice with regards to your property journey. Thanks, and see you next time.